The tea came down across the Duke of Northwood's hand and wrist in a scalding sheet, soaking the papers under it and the fine wool of his coat, and for the space of one breath the whole of the great cold library was silent. And Lucian Vane, ninth Duke of Northwood, did not move a muscle of his face, though the pain of it was considerable, because he had learned in 3 years that the one expression he would not permit himself before any living soul was the expression of a man who has been hurt. The maid who had spilled it stood frozen with the empty pot still tilted in her hand. She was new. He did not know her name. She had come in with the tray while he was working and had reached across him to set it down, and had caught the pot's spout on the corner of the great atlas that lay open on the table, and the thing had gone over. He waited for what always came next, which was the flood of terrified apology, the near weeping, the wringing of hands, the awful cringing deference of a servant who has injured a duke and expects to be turned out for it. And he waited, too, for the thing that lay underneath all of that and was worse, the flicker of pity that crossed every face that dealt with him now, the swift involuntary glance down at the wheeled chair in which he sat and had sat for 3 years and would sit, his physicians agreed, for the rest of his life. The maid did neither. She set the pot down firmly on the tray out of the way. She took up the cloth that had come with the tea things, and without one word of apology she caught his scalded hand in her own and turned it palm up and pressed the cloth over the reddening skin of his wrist, holding it there with a steady pressure. And she said, in a plain low voice with the flat vowels of the North Country under a careful gentility, "Cold water. Not the cloth that only holds the heat in. Beg pardon, your grace, but keep still a moment." And she reached past him again, deliberately, and took up the water jug that stood on the side table, and poured it cold over his wrist and hand into the slop bowl, a long, slow, steady pour, and the pain of the scald eased under it, and she watched his hand and not his face while she did it, which no one had done in 3 years. Lucian Vane looked at the top of her bent head, at the plain servant's cap and the brown hair beneath it, and found that he had, for the first time in longer than he could remember, no idea at all what a person was going to do next. "You have ruined the Duke's papers, Sarah," said Mrs. Prout, the housekeeper, arriving in a rustle of black bombazine and horror, "and scalded his hand, and I am sure I do not know what his grace will." "Her name is not Sarah," said Lucian. Both women looked at him. "You called her Sarah, you have got it wrong. What is your name?" "Eliza, your grace," the maid said. "Eliza Sharp, I came Tuesday." She had not let go of his hand. She poured the last of the water, examined the wrist with a frank clinical attention, and only then released it and stepped back and folded her hands and looked at him directly, which servants did not do, and which he found he did not mind. "I am very sorry for your papers. I am not sorry for pouring the water on you without asking, for it was the right thing and there was no time to ask, and I would do it again. If you mean to turn me off for it, I would take it kindly if you would let Mrs. Prout give me a character first, for I need the place, and it was the pot that spilled and not my carelessness, or not only my carelessness, the atlas ought not to have been so near the edge." Mrs. Prout made a sound like a kettle. Lucian held up his unscalded hand, and the housekeeper subsided, because when the Duke of Northwood held up his hand people subsided. The accident had taken his legs, but it had not touched the cold clear authority that had made men obey him since he was 22, and if anything the authority had grown, in 3 years of isolation, into something absolute and a little terrible. "You are informing me," he said slowly, "that the ruin of a 200-year-old atlas and the scalding of a duke is partly the atlas's own fault for being near the edge of the table." "Partly, your grace. I'll not take the whole of it. I'll take my share and no more, that being the just way to reckon a fault." She paused, and then, because she was evidently a woman who could not leave a true thing unsaid, "And the atlas is not ruined. The tea has wetted the margin of the western sheet, and if it is pressed flat between clean blotting paper under weights while it is still damp and dried slow away from the fire, it will cockle a little at the edge and be otherwise as it was. My father had books. I know how to save a wetted page. I could see to it now if you would let me, and to your hand, which should have a salve on it and a loose wrapping, and not that tight kid glove you have half drawn on, which will blister the skin as it swells. I have overstepped, I know, I do it. It is my great fault, and I have been turned off for it before. But I would rather be turned off for saying a useful true thing than kept on for a useless false silence. So there it is, your grace, and you may do as you think best. Lucian Vane looked at Eliza Sharp for a long moment across the wreck of his tea, and something happened in him that had not happened in 3 years. Some small movement of interest, of appetite, of a mind long starved of anything it had not already digested 100 times, meeting suddenly a thing it could not predict. He was 36, and he had been the most sought and feared man in 3 counties before a horse, and a stone wall on a black morning had broken his back and his life together. And in the 3 years since, he had been suffocated slowly, not by his injury, which he had learned to command, but by the softness of everyone around him, the hush, the pity, the endless gentle terrified deference, the way a whole household had rearranged itself around the idea that the Duke was a broken thing to be managed and spared and never, ever crossed. He had grown in that hush colder and more solitary and more absolute, because command was the one power the accident had left him, and he had wielded it like a man holding his own head above water. And now a housemaid who had come on Tuesday had poured cold water on him without asking, and told him a fault was partly in Atlas's, and informed him his glove would blister his hand, and offered to save his wedded page and looked him in the eye, and threatened to be turned off before she would be silent. And Lucian found that he had not in 3 years wanted anything, and that he wanted, very much, to know what this extraordinary young woman would say next. "You will not be turned off," he said. "Mrs. Prout, leave us. Miss Sharp will see to the Atlas, and to my hand, since she appears to have opinions about both, and I find I am curious to see whether her opinions are worth what she plainly thinks they are worth. Send Beckett with the blotting paper and weights, and a salve from the still-room, and then leave us. I am not accustomed to being poured upon, and I wish to examine the phenomenon." Mrs. Prout went, radiating disapproval and relief in equal measure, and Eliza Sharp rolled up her sleeves and set about saving the Atlas of the 9th Duke of Northwood, and Lucian Vane sat in his wheeled chair and watched her do it, and did not once, all the while, feel her pity him, and understood that this absence, this single blessed absence in a life gone thick with pity, was the most refreshing thing that had happened to him since the black morning at the wall. He learned over the following hour, watching her press and blot the damp sheet with a deftness that bore out every word she had said, a little of who she was. She was not what she seemed, or not only. She had the hands and the cap of a housemaid and the vowels of the North, but she had a gentlewoman's care with a book and a gentlewoman's grammar under the careful flattening of her speech. And when he asked her, idly testing whether she could read, she looked at him with a flash of something proud and rueful and said, "I can read Latin, your grace, though I have small occasion for it in the scullery," and would say no more and pressed the Atlas, and Lucian filed it away, the Latin the father who had books. The having been turned off before for saying true things, filed it away the way he filed away every fact worth having, and resolved, with the first real resolve he had formed in 3 years, to find out the whole of Eliza Sharp. It was Beckett, his manservant, who told him the servants' hall version that evening, lifting him from the chair to the bed with the practiced impersonal strength of 6 years' service, the one man in the house Lucian permitted to handle him, because Beckett had been a soldier and had nursed men, and did it without a flicker of pity briskly, as one competent man helping another. Lucian could bear Beckett's hands where he could bear no one else's. Miss Sharp, Beckett reported, was a mystery below stairs. She kept herself to herself. She had come with a plain character from a parsonage 2 counties off, and worked hard and gave herself no airs, but the other maids had noticed she read the newspaper the butler discarded, and corrected the footman's arithmetic once without seeming to mean to, and had a way of speaking, when she forgot to flatten it, that was not a servant's way. And there was a story, Beckett said, though no one knew the truth of it, that she was a ruined gentleman's daughter come down in the world, an apothecary's or a parson's or a physician's, fall into service when the family money failed, as happened, God knew, often enough. She's not afraid of you, your grace, Beckett added, settling the pillows with his soldier's economy. The others said, poured water on you and never turned a hair. They think her mad. I think, said Beckett, who had earned over 6 years the right to an opinion, she may be the first person to come into this house in 3 years who sees a man in that chair and not a tragedy. Which, if I may say so, your grace, is a thing you have wanted rather badly, whether or not you'd say so, and I would keep her, mystery or no. Lucian lay in the dark after Beckett had gone and looked at the ceiling he knew by heart, and thought about cold water poured without asking, and Latin in the scullery, and a young woman who would rather be turned off for a true word than kept for a false silence. And for the first time in 3 years the long night ahead of him did not seem a thing merely to be endured until morning, but a thing with a question in it, and the question was what Eliza Sharp would say tomorrow, and he found, turning it over in the dark, that he was almost, absurdly, looking forward to finding out. He gave her the atlas to keep, which is to say he found reasons, over the following weeks, to require Eliza Sharp in the library, and no one dared question it, because the Duke of Northwood required what he required and had done so all his life. The reasons were real, or real enough. Lucian Vane was engaged, and had been for 2 years, on a work that had become the whole occupation of a mind too large for the life his accident had left him. He was making a survey and history of the entire Northwood estate, 40,000 acres and 11 villages and 400 years of records, a great documentary map of every field and boundary and tenancy and ancient right, the sort of thing that had never been done, and that his steward said could not be done, and that Lucian was doing from a wheeled chair, out of the estate's own muniment room and his own formidable memory. Partly because it needed doing and chiefly because it was a mountain vast enough to occupy a man who could no longer ride a hedgerow or walk a boundary, and had to conquer his acres with paper instead. It was exacting work, full of crabbed old deeds in law Latin and court hand, and it wanted a second pair of literate hands, and Lucian had never found a clerk he could bear, because the clerks pitied him or feared him or both, and a man cannot work 12 hours a day beside someone who flinches. Eliza Sharp did not flinch. He set her, half as a test, to copying a 15th-century grant, expecting her to founder on the abbreviations, and she read the court hand nearly as well as he did, and copied it clean and fast, and queried in the margin a place where the original scribe had plainly miscopied a boundary, which Lucian had missed. He looked at the query a long time. "Where," he said, "does a housemaid learn to read a court hand and catch a 15th-century clerk in an error?" "From a father who taught her, your grace," Eliza said, not looking up from the next skin, because he had no son and thought a girl's mind as good as a boy's and was accounted eccentric for thinking so and was right. She wrote a line. "He was a physician, a good one. He is dead." There was debt as there is always debt, and a brother-in-law who managed it worse than he need have, and at the end of it there was me, and a choice between a bad marriage and honest service, and I chose service, and I do not regret it, though I regret the marriage I did not make about once a fortnight, generally on washing day. She looked up then, briefly, with the flash of rue he had come to watch for. "You may make what you like of it, your grace. I do not tell it for pity. I tell it because you asked plainly and I answer plainly, which I understand is a thing you and I have in common, and rarer than it ought to be. Now, this grant. The abbot's seal is described in the margin, but the seal itself is gone. Do you want the description copied or only the text?" "The description," said Lucian, "and everything else. Copy all of it. I begin to think, Miss Sharp, that you may be the only competent person in this county, and I do not intend to waste you on the scullery." So it was arranged, over the objections of Mrs. Prout and the scandal of the servants' hall, that Eliza Sharp was removed from the general work of the house and made, in effect, the Duke's clerk, given a small clean room off the library and a decent black gown and a wage that made the other maids stare, and set to work beside him on the great survey. And the household, which had spent 3 years arranged around the tragedy of its master, did not know what to make of a master who suddenly worked 12 hours a day with a fierce, sustained energy it had thought gone forever, or of the plain brown-haired young woman who was, everyone agreed, the cause of it, though no one could say quite how. They worked. That was the thing Lucian would try, years later, to make people understand, when they wanted the story to be a romance, and could not see that the romance was the work. That what grew between the Duke of Northwood and Eliza Sharp grew over deeds and boundaries and law Latin, hour by hour, day by day, in the plain shared labor of two good minds bent on the same hard task, and that this was a deeper intimacy than any moonlit garden, because it was built on the discovery, mutual and slow and astonished, that each of them had at last met a mind that could keep pace with their own. He gave her harder and harder work, and she rose to all of it. She began to argue with his conclusions, respectfully at first and then not respectfully at all, and to be right often enough that he came to rely on the arguments, to hold back his own judgment until he had heard her attack it. She had a memory nearly as good as his and a skepticism better, a refusal to accept a comfortable reading of an ambiguous deed that saved the survey from a dozen errors. And she was not afraid of him. That was the ground of all of it. She would tell him he was wrong flatly, and tell him his temper was showing, and tell him once when he had worked 18 hours and driven himself into a white-lipped exhaustion, "You will stop now, Your Grace, and let Beckett put you to bed, for you are no use to me or the survey dead, and you are making mistakes, and a mistake made tired takes 3 days to find and 1 minute to make, so stop." And he had looked at her, astonished, and stopped, because she was right, and because no one in 3 years had dared to tell the Duke of Northwood to go to bed. He did not think of it as courtship. He had put courtship and marriage and the whole apparatus of the tender affections away with his riding boots on the black morning at the wall. A man who cannot stand does not, in the settled opinion of the 9th Duke of Northwood, offer himself to a woman, and Lucian held that opinion about himself with an iron finality he did not examine, because to examine it would be to hope, and he had made himself, deliberately, a man who did not hope. So he did not court Eliza Sharp. He merely arranged his entire existence around her presence, and worked beside her 12 hours a day, and thought about her arguments in the long nights, and found the house intolerable on the rare Sundays she was not in it, and called all of this the natural satisfaction of a scholar who has at last found a competent clerk, and believed it, because he had spent 3 years becoming expert at not looking directly at the things he could not have. It could not last uninterrupted, because Lucian Vane was a duke, and a duke's isolation is never entirely his own to keep. 2 people in particular had an interest in the Duke of Northwood, and both of them descended on Northwood Hall that autumn, and between them they very nearly wrecked the fragile new thing that had begun over the deeds. The first was his aunt, Lady Aurelia Vane, his late father's sister, a formidable old woman who had appointed herself, since the accident, the guardian of the family's future, and who arrived every autumn to press upon Lucian the one subject he refused to discuss, which was the succession. For the Duke of Northwood had no son and no wife, and after the accident had let it be known that he would take neither. And this meant that the great title and the 40,000 acres would pass, on his death, to his cousin, and Lady Aurelia did not approve of the cousin, and said so, at length, every autumn, and pressed Lucian to marry some suitable woman and get an heir, and refused to be told that a man in a wheeled chair had put such things behind him. "Nonsense," she said that autumn in the tone of a woman who had buried 2 husbands and feared nothing. "Your legs are broken, Lucian, not your loins nor your judgment, and there is not a thing to prevent you marrying but your own pride, which you have let grow into a positive monument since the accident. There are a dozen good women who would have you gladly, chair and all, for you are still a duke, and still, when you are not sulking, a handsome one, marry, get a son. Do not let Northwood go to that oily creature Gervase, for want of your unbending an inch." Lucian told her, as he told her every year, that the subject was closed, and Lady Aurelia sniffed and stayed a fortnight, and made his life a misery, and noticed, with the sharp eyes of an old woman who had spent 60 years watching people, the plain brown-haired clerk who worked beside her nephew 12 hours a day and told him to go to bed, and drew her own conclusions, and kept them, for the moment, to herself. The second arrival was the oily creature Gervase. Mr. Gervase Vane was Lucian's first cousin, and in the absence of a son, his heir. A smooth, handsome, plausible man of 40 with expensive habits and thin means, and a smile that never reached his eyes, who had, since the accident, taken to visiting Northwood with a solicitude that Lucian found more insulting than open enmity would have been, because it was the solicitude of a man visiting an investment. Gervase came to see how the Duke did. Gervase hoped the Duke was comfortable. Gervase deprecated with elaborate sorrow the strain the Great Survey must place on so frail a constitution, and wondered whether his Grace ought not to rest and spare himself, and leave such exertions to younger and, he did not quite say, sounder men. Gervase, in short, had every reason in the world to wish his cousin to remain exactly as he had been for 3 years, isolated, hopeless, childless, and declining, and every reason to be alarmed by any sign that the Duke of Northwood had found something to live for. And Gervase, arriving that autumn to find his cousin transformed, working with a fierce new energy, arguing and laughing over deeds with a sharp-eyed young clerk of mysterious origin, was very much alarmed indeed, and hid it behind his smile, and set himself, with the patient malice of a man protecting an inheritance, to discover what had changed at Northwood, and to change it back. Lucian saw through Gervase completely, and always had, and despised him with the clean contempt he reserved for very few. But he underestimated, that autumn, how much damage a plausible frightened man will do to protect 40,000 acres, and he underestimated, too, the one weapon Gervase would find to hand, which was the plain and awkward and undeniable fact that the Duke of Northwood had fallen, without admitting it even to himself, in love with a housemaid, and that a housemaid, in the world as it was constituted, was a thing a duke might ruin but could not marry. And that this fact, in the hands of a man like Gervase, was not a private matter of the heart at all, but a lever long enough to move everything. The household did not know what to make of the change, and Lucian watched it fail to know with a private grim amusement that was itself a sign of how far he had come, for a man who can be amused has begun, in some corner of himself, to live again. Northwood Hall had run for 3 years on a single unspoken rule, which was that nothing was ever to disturb the Duke, and that the Duke was a sorrow to be tiptoed around. And the rule had made the whole great house into a kind of sick-room, hushed and careful and dead, in which the servants moved on soft feet and lowered their voices, and arranged their faces into the tender solemnity one wears at a long illness. And Lucian, in the center of it, had grown to loathe every soft footstep and lowered voice, because each of them was a small daily reminder that he was the thing being tiptoed around. He had not known how much he loathed it until Eliza Sharp walked through the middle of it as though it were not there. She did not lower her voice, she did not soften her step. She came into the library each morning briskly, and said good morning as though it were an ordinary morning in an ordinary house, and set to work. And when the Duke was wrong she said so, and when the Duke was in a black temper she declined to be frightened by it. And once, when he had snapped at her out of pain and weariness with a coldness that had reduced footmen to trembling, she had simply set down her pen and looked at him and said, "You are in pain today, and it is making you unkind." And I do not take unkindness personally when it is really pain wearing a cross face, so I shall not regard it. But you might apologize when the pain eases, for it was not deserved, and you know it was not, and a man who deals in true things ought to deal in them even when his back hurts. And she had gone back to her copying, and Lucian had sat astonished, and had, when the pain eased an hour later, apologized stiffly, the first apology the 9th Duke of Northwood had offered a servant in his life, and Eliza had accepted it with a nod and no fuss, as though it were the most natural thing in the world for a duke to apologize to his clerk, and the matter had been closed cleanly, and something between them had settled onto a new and firmer footing. The servants' hall watched all this with a fascination bordering on scandal. Below stairs, opinion was divided and passionate. Mrs. Prout held that Miss Sharp was above herself and would come to grief, and disapproved on principle of any arrangement that had not existed 20 years ago. Becket held and said so with a soldier's bluntness that ended most arguments, that Miss Sharp had done more good to the master in a month than all the doctors in 3 years, and that any fool who could not see it might take it up with him. The younger maids, who had begun by resenting the housemaid raised so suddenly above them, came round one by one, because Eliza, raised, did not lord it, but remembered their names and their troubles and took the part of the scullery girl when the cook was unjust, and taught the youngest housemaid her letters in the evenings without being asked. So that even those inclined to envy her found the envy hard to sustain against a person who used her small new elevation entirely for the benefit of the people she had left below her. And the whole hall watched, above all, the thing none of them could quite name, the plain astonishing fact that the Duke, the hushed sorrow at the center of the dead house, had come alive, worked and argued, and even twice that everyone knew of laughed aloud, and that the cause of it walked among them in a plain black gown and a housemaid's memory of the scullery. Lucian knew they talked. He did not care, or told himself he did not, until the day he understood that the talk had reached a shape that mattered, and it was Becket, loyal and blunt, who told him. "They are saying, Your Grace," Becket reported one evening, settling the pillows in the hall and beginning to say it in the village, "that you have grown fond of Miss Sharp. I tell them to hold their tongues, and they hold them while I am by, and talk the more when I am gone, for that is the way of it. I mention it because a thing said in a servants' hall is halfway to being said in a drawing-room, and I would rather your Grace heard it from me than from your aunt or your cousin, who will neither of them hear it kindly." And Lucian had lain in the dark after Becket left and understood two things at once: that the talk was true, that he had grown fond of Eliza Sharp far past what fondness could safely be called, and that the world had begun to notice, and that the noticing would in time force a reckoning he was not ready for, because he had built no answer to it, having refused for 3 years to look directly at the thing the talk had named. He looked at it now in the dark, and found it larger than he had let himself know. It was not the fondness of a lonely man for a competent clerk. It was the plain fact that Eliza Sharp had become the axis on which his days turned, that he woke thinking of what she would say to the eastern boundary, and slept turning over some dry remark she had made that had lodged in him like a burr, that the house was a tomb on the Sundays she spent with the other servants, and a living place the moment she came into the library, that he had, without deciding to, arranged his entire reduced existence around the presence of a woman he could not, in the world as it was made, ever offer himself to, being a duke and a cripple, and she a housemaid, 3 walls between them, each one high enough to be impossible. He lay in the dark and understood that he had let this happen with his eyes open, or half open, in the way a man lets himself do a thing he knows he must not, telling himself at each step that it was only the next small harmless step, and that he had now arrived, by small harmless steps, at loving a woman he could not have, which was the one grief 3 years of iron discipline had been meant to make forever impossible, and had failed, defeated by a tray of tea and a jug of cold water and a pair of steady gray eyes that had never once, in all these weeks, looked at him with pity. He resolved, that night in the dark, to be more careful, to hold himself back, to let the fondness cool to the safe temperature of an employer's regard before the talk in the hall became talk in the drawing-room and did Eliza harm, for it was always the woman the world punished, never the man, and he would not have her punished for his want. It was a good resolution and an honorable one, and he held to it for the better part of a fortnight, keeping a new coolness in the library, setting her more work and less conversation, sending her away at the day's end without the long talk that had grown up between them. And the coolness deceived no one, least of all Eliza, who bore it a week and then set down her pen one afternoon and said, "You have gone cold with me these 10 days, Your Grace, and I have let you, thinking it was pain or temper, but it is neither, it is a decision. I can tell your decisions, they have a particular chill. And I think I know what it is, and I will not embarrass either of us by naming it, but I will say one thing and then we need never speak of it. Whatever you are protecting me from by going cold, I would rather have the warmth and the risk than the coldness and the safety, for I have had a great deal of safety in my life, and it is a poor cold thing, and I did not become a duke's clerk to be kept at arm's length for my own good by a man who is lonelier than any person I ever met. There, I have overstepped again. I always do. Now stop being cold, for the work goes twice as slow when you are, and the eastern parishes will not survey themselves. And Lucian undone had stopped being cold, because he had never in his life been able to hold a position against Eliza Sharp once she had decided it was foolish, and because she had named, without naming it, the exact bad bargain he had been trying to make, the whole warmth of his revived life traded away for her safety, and had refused the bargain on her own behalf, as was her right, and left him with no honorable ground to stand on. And the fortnight's coolness ended, and the warmth came back, and with it the danger, and Lucian let the danger come, because a man cannot live long in a tomb once he has remembered what the living air tastes like, and Eliza Sharp was the living air, and he had stopped, whatever the cost would someday be, being willing to do without her. It was Eliza who got him out of doors again, which no one had managed in 3 years, and she did it, characteristically, not by coaxing but by need. The survey had reached the western boundary, a disputed line along the old drove road where the deeds and the map and the memory of the oldest tenant all disagreed, and Lucian had been fretting at it on paper for a week, unable to resolve from documents a question that could only be settled by the ground itself. And Eliza had listened to him fret, and had said, matter of fact, "Then we must go and look at it, your grace. The bank the grant speaks of will be there or it will not, and the old boundary oak either stands or its stump does, and no amount of glaring at the deed will tell us. There is a Maid road the whole way," I asked Beckett. "The chair will go, with the garden barrow's wheels put on it that he has been meaning to fit these 6 months, and if the chair will not go the last field, Beckett and the 2 grooms will carry it, for they are strong men and it is their work, and you will let them, because the alternative is never to settle the western boundary, and you cannot bear that. I have watched you not bear it for a week." And she had gathered the deeds in her copying box and put on her bonnet, and Lucian had found himself, an hour later, out under the open sky for the first time in 3 years, going down the drove road in a chair on barrow wheels with a housemaid walking beside him, reading a 15th century grant aloud, and had been so undone by the mere feel of the wind, and the smell of the turned autumn fields that he had had to look hard at the hedgerow for a while and say nothing. Eliza had noticed, of course. She noticed everything, and had said nothing either and given him the hedgerow and the time and only remarked presently in her plain way, "It is a great foolishness, if you will forgive me, that you have not done this in 3 years. Not a weakness, a foolishness. You shut yourself in a library because you could not bear to be seen carried, and so you gave up the sky to spare your pride a bruise, and it was a bad bargain, your grace, the worst I ever heard of, the whole sky for a bruise. You are not less a man for being carried across a field. You are less a man for sitting 3 years in a dark room to avoid it. There is the bank the grant speaks of, do you see, exactly where the deed says. So the map is wrong and the deed is right and the drove road is the true line. And I have got mud on your good deed and it does not signify, and you are smiling, your grace, which I have not seen you do out of doors, and it suits you, and I shall say no more about it, for you will only frown to spite me." Lucian had not been able to help the smile, and had not for once frowned to spite her. They settled the western boundary that afternoon on the ground in the wind, the Duke of Northwood carried across the last muddy field in his chair by 2 grooms and Beckett, while a housemaid walked ahead reading Latin. And it was, Lucian thought, one of the strangest and best days of his life, and it broke something open in him that had been sealed for 3 years, so that after it he went out often and reclaimed his acres in the flesh as well as on paper. And the tenants who had not seen their duke in 3 years saw him now, carried along their lanes, sharp-eyed and commanding and interested in everything. And the story went round the estate that the Duke of Northwood had come back to life, and no one could say how, except that it had something to do with the clever young woman who walked beside his chair and was not afraid of him. It was on the drove road another day that he told her about the wall. He had not meant to. He did not speak of the accident. It was the one subject on which even Lucian's iron command failed him, the black morning that had ended his old life, the horse refusing at the wall, the fall, the stone, the long red agony and the longer gray one after, the slow terrible understanding that his legs were gone and would not come back. He had never told the whole of it to a living soul. And yet on the drove road in the low autumn light, with Eliza copying beside him and no one else by, he found himself telling her plainly, the way she told him things, the whole of the black morning. And she did not stop him and did not pity him, and did not offer him the hateful comforts, God's purpose or courage or the many blessings that remained. She only listened completely with her copying laid down, and when he had finished she was quiet a while and then she said, "That is a very great loss and I am sorry for it, and I will not insult you by pretending it is anything but what it is, which is a life taken from you and another put in its place that you did not choose and would not have chosen. But I will tell you one thing, your grace, because it is true and you deal in true things. The man on the horse before the wall, the one you grieve, the whole and striding duke that all the county feared, I never knew him, and I am not sorry. I know the man in the chair." And the man in the chair caught a 15th-century clerk in an error, and settled the western boundary on the ground in the wind, and told me the truth about the worst morning of his life on a drove road, and made me laugh twice this week, and is, I think, though I have small means of comparison, a better man than the one on the horse, or at least a deeper one, for grief deepens a man if it does not drown him, and you did not drown, though you came near it in that dark library. I am glad of the man in the chair. I would not trade him for the man on the horse. There. I have said a thing I ought not to have said to a duke, and I do not take it back, and now hand me the western sheet, for the light is going and I mean to finish this line. Lucian Vane had looked at Eliza Sharp for a long time in the low light of the drove road, and had understood, with a clarity that frightened him more than the wall had frightened him, that he loved her, and that it was hopeless, and that the two facts together made a wound the accident had never come near, because his broken back was a thing that had been done to him, and this was a thing he had done to himself, letting a housemaid become the whole light of his life when the world would never, not in 1,000 years, let a duke marry his clerk. He had said nothing. He had taken the western sheet and finished the line himself while she watched, and they had gone home in the dusk, and Lucian had lain awake that night with the new wound, and understood that he had spent 3 years believing the accident had taken everything he had to lose, and had been wrong because it had left him this, the capacity to love and be unable to have, and that this was the cruelest thing of all, and that he would not, even so, even knowing it was hopeless, have given back a single day on the drove road. Lady Aurelia saw it before he admitted it to himself, as she saw most things. She cornered him in the library the day before she left and shut the door and sat down opposite his chair and said, without preamble, "You are in love with your clerk. I am obliged to you, aunt, for your delicacy." "I have no delicacy. I am 74. I have buried it with my husband's. You are in love with the Sharp girl and she with you. Any fool with eyes can see it, and I have watched you both a fortnight and I am no fool. Now," the old woman folded her hands on the head of her stick, "I am going to say a thing, Lucian, and you will not like it, and you will hear it out, because I love you and I am the only person left who will tell you the truth to your face except, I gather, the girl herself. She is a physician's daughter, come down through no fault of her own, gently bred, better educated than half the debutantes in London, and a person of the first quality of mind and character, and if the world were a just place, there would be no bar at all. But the world is not just, and she is in service in your house and has been your housemaid, and the world will never call it anything but a duke ruining a maid, however pure the truth of it, and if you marry her you will pour scandal and cruelty over her head for the rest of both your lives, and she will bear the whole of it, for the world punishes the woman always and never the man. That is the true case against it, and it is a heavy one and you must weigh it honestly. But—" and here the old woman's voice changed, and Lucian looked up, "but I did not come to tell you it is impossible. I came to tell you that I am 74, and I have watched a great many people arrange their lives sensibly, marrying suitably and living correctly and dying, at the end, having never once been loved by a person who saw them plainly and stayed. And I have watched a very few people be foolish, and marry where their hearts were against all sense, and bear the world's cruelty for it, and be, in the teeth of everything, happy. And I have come to think at the end of my life that the foolish ones had the right of it, and that the sensible ones, myself among them, wasted the only thing that was ever worth having. You are already an object of the world's pity, Lucian. You have borne that 3 years. I put it to you that a man who has learned to bear the world's pity can learn to bear the world's scandal, and that the scandal, unlike the pity, would come with the one thing that might make the whole of the rest worth having. I do not tell you to marry her. I tell you not to refuse her out of a nobility that is really only fear wearing its Sunday coat. Weigh it honestly, both sides. That is all I ask. Now help me up, I have said my say, and I mean to beat your Mrs. Prude at piquet before I go, for she cheats, and I enjoy catching her at it. And she had gone, and left Lucian in the library with the door shut, and his aunt's words turning over in him like the deep, slow turning of the earth. And he had sat there a long time in the dying light, weighing, honestly, both sides, and finding that the scale would not settle, because on the one side was every argument of sense and honor and the plain, cruel machinery of the world, and on the other was only Eliza Sharp walking beside his chair down a drove road, saying, "I am glad of the man in the chair," and he could not make the one outweigh the other however long he sat, because they were not the same kind of thing. And no scale had ever been made that could weigh a lifetime of correct loneliness against a single true day in the wind. The magistrate's bench was the first place the wider world saw the Duke of Northwood restored, and it was there that Eliza first saw for herself the thing Lucian most wished no one to see, which was how the world had treated him for 3 years, and how he had learned to bear it. He had been a magistrate before the accident, as the great landowner of the district was expected to be, and after it he had let the duty lapse, unable to face the courtroom and the eyes. But the survey had drawn him back into the affairs of his acres, and the affairs of his acres had drawn him back, that winter, into the affairs of his neighbors, and there came a session of the quarter bench that could not properly be held without him, a matter of a disputed right-of-way that touched the Northwood boundaries, and on which no other magistrate had the knowledge. And Lucian, after a hard private struggle that Eliza witnessed and did not comment on, resolved to attend, and was carried into the session house in his chair. And Eliza, who had made the abstracts of the boundary evidence, came with him to hand him his papers. She saw that day what 3 years had been. She saw the little silence that fell when the Duke of Northwood was wheeled in, the whole room adjusting its face. She saw the other magistrates, decent men, overdo their heartiness to cover their discomfort, and the clerks avert their eyes from the chair, and a stranger in the public gallery lean to his neighbor and whisper behind his hand, with a glance at the Duke that Eliza would have liked to answer with her fist. She saw the whole apparatus of pity and unease and morbid interest that assembled itself around a great man brought low, and she saw Lucian sit in the middle of it, straight-backed and cold-eyed, and give not 1 inch to any of it, and she understood, watching, the exact price he had paid for 3 years to keep the one thing the wall had left him. And then she saw him take the bench. For once the boundary matter was called and Lucian began to speak, the room changed. He knew the case cold, the deeds and the ancient usage and the law, better than any man there, and he spoke with the flat, clear authority that had made men obey him all his life. And within 10 minutes the whispering stranger in the gallery had forgotten to whisper, and the over-hardy magistrates had fallen respectfully silent, and the clerks had stopped averting their eyes, because there was nothing pitiable to look at any longer. There was only the sharpest legal mind in the county taking a tangled case apart with a few precise strokes and putting it back together rightly, and the disputed right-of-way, which had vexed the district for a decade, was settled that afternoon by the Duke of Northwood so plainly and so justly that both parties went away satisfied, which is the rarest outcome a bench can produce. Eliza watched the room forget the chair. She watched the pity die of simple irrelevance in the face of a man doing difficult work supremely well, and she thought, handing him his next paper, that this was the whole of it. This was what he had been trying to tell her without words all these weeks. That dignity was not a thing the world granted and could withdraw, but a thing a man carried in himself and proved by what he did, and that the surest cure for the world's pity was not to hide from it, as he had hidden 3 years, but to walk out into the middle of it and be, plainly and undeniably, excellent, until the pity had nothing left to stand on. He was gray with exhaustion by the end of it, and in pain, and he let no one see either until they were in the carriage and away. And only then, with the door shut and Beckett up beside the coachman, did he let his head fall back against the squabs and close his eyes, and Eliza, sitting across from him, said nothing for a while, and then said quietly, "You settled in an afternoon what 6 magistrates could not settle in 10 years, and you did it in front of a room that came to pity you and left forgetting to, and it cost you everything you have, and no one in that room will ever know what it cost, and I do because I watched. And I am not going to insult you by making a fuss of it. I am only going to say that I understand now what you meant about your dignity, that it is your own and the world cannot touch it. I understand it because I saw it today. I saw the world reach for its pity and find nothing to pity, and it was the finest thing I have watched a person do, and I have watched you do a good many fine things. That is all. Rest now. It is an hour home, and you have earned the hour." And Lucian, his eyes still closed, had said, "You are the only person who has ever come with me into a room like that and not once, all day, made me feel the chair. Do you know what that is worth, Eliza? 3 years I have gone into such rooms alone, because to bring anyone was to bring their unease, their careful softness, one more person managing my tragedy. And today I brought you, and you handed me my papers as though I were any man doing his work, and the whole day was bearable, more than bearable, because you were in it treating it as ordinary. You make the world ordinary around me. It is the greatest gift anyone has given me since the wall, and I do not know how to thank you for it. And I find I do not want to thank you for it, because thanking you would make it a favor, and it is not a favor. It is only how you are, and I would rather it stayed only how you are than became a kindness you did me. For I have had enough of kindnesses done me to last a lifetime, and not enough, until you, of being simply, ordinarily seen." He had opened his eyes then, and looked at her across the swaying carriage in the failing winter light, and there had been a moment, a long moment, in which the thing between them stood entirely open in the small space, unnamed and undeniable, and Lucian had come nearer than he had ever come to reaching across the carriage and taking her hand. And had not, because the walls were still there, the 3 impossible walls, and because he was still trying, out of a battered honor, to protect her from the want that would do her harm in the eyes of the world. And Eliza had seen the notch reaching, and understood it and let it be, for she too could count the walls, and neither of them said the thing, and the moment passed, and the carriage carried them home through the dusk. 2 people who loved each other and could both name 3 good reasons why it was impossible, and neither of whom, secretly in the deepest place, believed the reasons any longer. Though it would take a snake in a parlor and a housemaid's flight, and 40 miles of pursuit before either of them found the courage to say so. There was a night before Gervais spoiled everything that Lucian kept always, the way a man keeps the last clear day of a season, because it was the nearest they came, in all the weeks before the flight, to letting the thing between them be spoken, and because it was the night he understood that Eliza carried her own grief as carefully hidden as he carried his, and that they were, in this as in everything, 2 of a kind. It was late, past midnight, and Lucian could not sleep for the ache in his back that came on the cold nights, and rather than lie fighting it, he had had Beckett settle him in the library by the banked fire, where he often passed the bad hours with a book he did not read. And Eliza, whose small room was off the library and who slept lightly, had heard him, and had come out in her wrapper with a candle, not to fuss, never to fuss, but only, she said, because if he was going to be awake he might as well have company, and the eastern parishes would go faster tonight than his sleep would come. And they had not worked. They had sat by the banked fire in the deep quiet of the sleeping house, and talked, low, the way people talk at that hour when the day's defenses are down, and Lucian had found himself telling her things he told no one, and had found her, for once, telling him things in return that she told no one either. He learned that night the whole of her ruin, which she had never given him entire. The physician father who taught his daughter Latin and thought her mind as good as any man's, the mother dead early, the good years of a modest, happy household full of books, when Eliza had believed she would marry a country doctor or a clergyman and keep a house full of books of her own. And then the father's slow decline, and the debts that were not his fault but a partner's, and the brother-in-law who managed the estate at the end and managed it for his own advantage, and let it be understood, to cover himself, that the fault had been the dead physician's, a slander Eliza had had to swallow, because a portionless orphan cannot fight a respectable man's version of events. And the offer of marriage that had come at the lowest point, from a coarse prosperous grazier twice her age who had wanted a genteel wife cheap, and had made it clear he expected gratitude for taking a ruined girl, and Eliza's refusal of him, which everyone had called madness, a ruined woman refusing bread, and the choice of service instead, honest work and her own poor freedom over a comfortable cage, which had cost her every friend she had, all of whom thought her proud and foolish and said so. So you see, she finished, looking into the banked fire, we are not so different, your grace, you and I, whatever the three walls between us. You lost your legs and I lost my place in the world, and we both of us discovered the same thing, which is that when you lose the life you were meant to have, everyone around you decides who you are now, and mostly they decide you are a smaller thing, a tragedy or a cautionary tale or a ruined girl who ought to have taken the grazier, and the whole fight of the rest of your life is to go on knowing you are not the smaller thing they have decided you are. You fought it with your dignity in a library. I fought it by refusing the grazier and scrubbing floors instead, which is a less grand way of fighting it but the same fight. I never told anyone that before. I do not know why I have told you, except that it is past midnight and your fire is warm, and you are the only person I ever met who would understand it without pitying me, which is the same reason, I think, that you tell me things. We are each other's one safe person, your grace. I have not had a safe person since my father died. I did not know how much I wanted one until I had one again, and it frightens me rather how much, for safe persons can be lost, and I have learned to travel light. Lucian had looked at her a long time across the small, warm space, at the plain, brave face in the candlelight, and had understood that she had just told him she loved him, in the only language either of them could safely use, the language of true things said sideways. And he had wanted, with an ache far deeper than the one in his back, to say it plainly back to her, to reach across the little distance and take her hand and tell her that the three walls were nothing, that he did not care, that a physician's daughter who refused a grazier and read Latin in a scullery was worth every duchess in England and more. And he had got as far as her name, Eliza, in a voice that made her look up, the thing trembling on the edge of being said at last. And the case clock in the hall had struck one, loud in the sleeping house, and the spell had broken, and Lucian had lost the moment, as he seemed fated to lose every such moment until the very last, because some caution 3 years deep, some final unbelief that a man in a chair had any right to reach for happiness, closed his hand before it could open, and he had said instead of the thing, "You should go to bed. It is late and cold, and you will be no use to the eastern parishes exhausted, as someone once told me." And Eliza had looked at him a moment, and something had crossed her face, disappointment quickly hidden, understanding not hidden at all, and she had risen and taken up her candle and said at the door gently, "One of these days, your grace, you are going to finish a sentence you begin to me at midnight, and I shall be very interested to hear the end of it, but not tonight, I see. Good night. Ring if the pain worsens. I sleep light, and I would rather be waked than have you suffer alone out of consideration. For consideration that lets a friend suffer alone is only pride wearing a kind face, and you have enough pride already." And she had gone, and Lucian had sat by the banked fire until the ache eased toward dawn, cursing the caution that had closed his hand, not knowing that his chances to open it were running out, that a frightened cornered cousin was even then reckoning his debts and turning over the one lever that might yet save him. and that the sentence Lucian kept failing to finish at midnight would go unfinished until he had lost her and crossed 40 miles to find her, and would be finished at last not by a warm fire in a safe house, but in a stranger's parlor with everything already nearly too late. And he would wish ever after that he had finished it that night by the banked fire, when it would have spared them both so much. And would console himself ever after with the knowledge that Eliza had known the end of the sentence all along, had told him so at the door, and had waited for him to find the courage to say it, as she waited for him, patiently and stubbornly and without pity, to find the courage for every good thing he was too battered to reach for on his own. Gervase Vane paid 3 more visits to Northwood that autumn before the night he came in the dark, and Lucian, looking back, could see in each of them the plan forming, and cursed himself for having read them only as the ordinary insolence of a grasping heir, and not as the reconnaissance they were. His cousin came always with the same smooth solicitude, and Lucian received him always with the same cold courtesy, and beneath the courtesies each man took the other's measure. Gervase asked, each time after the Duke's health, and deprecated the great survey as a strain, and let fall with elaborate delicacy his concern for the estate's future should anything, God forbid, happen to dear Lucian. And each time his eyes went, when he thought himself unwatched, to the clever young clerk at her copying, and to the color that had come back into the Duke's face, and to the whole intolerable evidence that the investment Gervase had counted on to fail was thriving. Lucian saw the looks and misread their depth. He knew Gervase resented the change. He did not yet understand that Gervase, behind the smooth face, was a man watching his one hope of solvency slip away, and doing his sums at night, and growing every week more desperate and more dangerous. It was Eliza who read the danger truer than Lucian did, because Eliza had learned in her own ruin exactly what a respectable man will do when the money fails and the respectability is all that is left to lose. "I do not like your cousin, your Grace," she said, after the 3rd visit plainly, setting down her pen. "I have watched him 3 times now, and it is not the ordinary dislike of a man who wants your acres. There is fear under it, and a man who is afraid of losing everything is a different creature from a man who merely wants more. He looks at me as though he were reckoning something. He looks at you as though he were measuring a thing he means to move. I do not say he will do anything. I say only that I have seen that particular fear before, in my brother-in-law when the debts closed on him, and it made an ordinarily weak man do things he would not have believed himself capable of, to save himself. And I would have you careful of Mr. Gervase, careful in a way you are not being, for you dismiss him as beneath your notice, and a man beneath your notice who is also desperate is precisely the man who does the harm no one saw coming." Lucian had heard her and had half heeded her, and had told Beckett to keep an eye on Mr. Gervase's movements, but he had not truly believed, in his bones, that his plausible cowardly cousin would ever pass from insolence to action, because Lucian had lived his whole life among men who schemed within the rules and could not easily imagine one who would break them, and because a man secure in his own strength always underrates the desperation of the weak. He knew now that Eliza had been right, as she was so often right, and that he had been saved from the consequence of his own complacency, not by his own foresight but by hers, and by the will that had put him on his feet at the last extremity. And it was a lesson he did not forget ever after, that the person who has been ruined sees the approach of ruin in others more clearly than the person who has always been safe, and that he had married, among all her other gifts, a woman who could smell danger coming across a room, and that a wise man listens when such a woman says she does not like his cousin. There had been, too, in those autumn weeks, a warning Lucian had ignored from a different quarter, and this one he blamed himself for more, because it had come from Beckett, who did not speak idly. Beckett had reported once that Mr. Gervase had been seen in the town in company. Beckett did not like hard men, money-lenders' men, the sort of gentleman kept clear of unless his affairs had grown very bad indeed, and Lucian had filed it away as one more sign of his cousin's disorder and thought no more of it, when he should have thought a great deal more, for it was those very men, or others like them, that Gervase had brought up through the garden door in the black of the December night. Lucian understood afterward, assembling the whole of it with his cold thoroughness, that every piece of the danger had been laid before him in advance. Eliza's reading of the fear, Beckett's report of the company, the pattern of the reconnaissance visits, and that he had failed to assemble the pieces in time because he had been happy, and a happy man's guard is down, and because he had, despite everything, still carried in him the old great man's inability to believe that a creature he despised could truly threaten him. It was the last time in his life he made that particular error. He had risen from a chair to correct it, and would carry to his grave the knowledge of how nearly the correction had come too late, and he honored, ever after, the woman who had tried to warn him, and never again failed to weigh her judgment of a person at its true and considerable worth. Gervase Vane made his move in November, and he made it as such men do, not against the Duke, whom he feared, but against the woman whom he supposed he could frighten, and it was the great miscalculation of his life, though it did a good deal of harm before it failed. He had spent October watching, and had understood the shape of Northwood's transformation with the quickness of a frightened man, and had understood, too, that the greatest threat to his inheritance was no longer merely that his cousin might live, but that his cousin might marry and get an heir, and that the person who might make him do it was the clever housemaid. And Gervase had reasoned that a housemaid, unlike a duke, had everything to lose and no power to resist, and had gone to her privately on a gray afternoon when Lucian was closeted with his steward, and had made her, in his smooth, reasonable voice, an offer that was also a threat. Lucian learned the whole of it only afterward in pieces, and assembled it with the cold thoroughness he brought to a disputed boundary. Gervase had begun with money, a considerable sum, to leave Northwood quietly and never return, framed as a kindness, a provision for a deserving young woman who surely understood that her presence, however innocent, was compromising the Duke and could end only in scandal and her own ruin. Eliza had refused it. Gervase had then turned to her past, which he had been at some pains to investigate, and had found the bruise in it, not a shame of her own, but the manner of her father's ruin, and a story, half true and cruelly angled, that the brother-in-law who had mismanaged the debt had put about to cover his own conduct, a story that touched Eliza's dead father's honor and could be revived and spread. Gervase had offered, in his reasonable voice, to see that this story followed Eliza wherever she went, into every future situation, poisoning every character she might be given, unless she left Northwood and gave up whatever designs she had upon the Duke, and had added as the final turn of the screw that if she cared for his grace at all, as he could see she did, she would understand that to stay was to ruin him, to make the Duke of Northwood the man who married his housemaid, a byword and a joke in every club in London. His dignity, the one thing his accident had left him, dragged through the mud for her sake. And that a woman who truly loved a man would not do that to him, would take the money and the silence and go, and let him keep the one thing he had left. It was, Lucian would reflect, diabolically well aimed, because it was aimed not at Eliza's fear, which was slight, but at her love, which was great, and at the exact conviction she already held that a duke could not marry a maid without ruin. Gervase had merely dressed her own honorable scruple in the language of her love and handed it back to her as a duty. And Eliza Sharp, who was not afraid of Gervase, and would have thrown his money in his face and dared him to spread what he liked about herself, could not in the end bear the one argument, that to stay was to ruin the man she loved, because she believed it, had believed it before Gervase ever spoke, and Gervase had only given her the final push toward a thing half her honest heart already told her she must do. She did not tell Lucian. That was the cruelty of it and the nobility and the mistake. She reasoned in the long night after Gervase's visit that if she told the Duke, he would rage and forbid her to go, and perhaps in his anger do the very thing that would ruin him, declare himself, defy the world, marry her out of fury at his cousin, and that she loved him too well to let him wreck himself for her, and that the only gift she could give him, the only true gift, was to remove herself quietly and let him keep his dignity and his acres and his aunt's suitable marriage and his heir, and go back to being the man he had been before she poured cold water on him, whole in the one way that mattered, his name unspoiled. She reasoned herself that night into the belief that leaving was love, and it was the one time in the whole story that her clear mind failed her, because she reasoned from a false premise, the same false premise Gervase had planted and Lucian himself half held, that a duke's dignity was a thing made of the world's opinion and could be spoiled by a marriage. When the truth, which she would learn and he would prove, was that his dignity was made of something else entirely, something no marriage and no scandal and no club in London could touch. She left before dawn, 3 days later with her box and a plain note, while the house slept. Lucian found the note on the library table when Beckett wheeled him in at 7 in the gray first light, and he read it and read it again, and Beckett, watching, said afterward that he had never seen the Duke's face do what it did in that moment, go from the ordinary morning coldness to something white and still and terrible. The note was brief and steady and very like her. She thanked him for his kindness and the work, which she said had given her back a self she had thought lost. She said she had come to see that her presence at Northwood, however innocent, could bring him only scandal and injury, and that she cared too much for his good to be the cause of it. She said the survey wanted only the eastern parishes and that her notes were in order and he would finish it easily without her. She said he must not seek her, that it would do them both harm, and that she asked, as the one favor she would ever ask of him, that he let her go. She signed herself his grateful servant, Eliza Sharp, and there was a place at the bottom where the ink was blurred, a single spot, as though something had fallen on it, and Lucian looked at the blurred spot a long time, and understood that Eliza Sharp, who never wept, who had poured cold water on a duke without a tremor, had wept once writing that note, and had let a single tear fall on it, and had not blotted it out, the way she had once refused to leave out the truth of a wedded page. And it was that, the single unblotted tear, more than all the steady sentences, that told him the whole of what her leaving had cost her, and what it meant, and how wrong she was. He did not rage. Beckett had braced for the rage, and there was none. Lucian Vane sat in his chair in the gray light with the note in his hand and was very quiet, and then he said, in a voice from which every trace of the morning coldness had gone, leaving something far more dangerous, "Beckett, who was here 3 days ago, in the afternoon while I was with Marsh about the drainage. Someone was here, she would not have gone for nothing. Someone came and gave her a reason." "Who?" And Beckett, who missed little, said, "Mr. Gervase, your grace. He came at 3 and left at 4 and did not ask for you. I thought it odd. He spoke with Miss Sharp in the small parlor. I did not hear what passed. She was white after and worked late and was not herself these 3 days, and I ought to have told you, and I am sorry." "You could not have known." Lucian folded the note once precisely and put it inside his coat over his heart where it would stay. "Gervase came and frightened her, or worse, offered her something, and she is too proud to be frightened and too loving to be bought, so it was neither of those. It was the other thing, the thing that would move her. He will have told her that to stay is to ruin me. That is the only lever that would have shifted Eliza Sharp, because it is the only argument she half believes herself." He was silent a moment, and Beckett watched the Duke of Northwood do a thing he had not done in 3 years, which was to make a plan not for enduring a life but for changing it. "He has made 2 mistakes, my cousin. The first is that he supposed frightening a good woman into leaving would keep me as I was, hopeless and childless and declining, and it will not, Beckett, it will do the precise opposite, for it has shown me in a single note what 3 years of my aunt's lecturing could not, which is exactly what I want and exactly what I have been too much a coward to reach for. And the second mistake is larger. He supposed my dignity was a thing the world's opinion could spoil, and that Eliza believed it too, and he was right that she believes it, and wrong, gloriously wrong, that it is true. My dignity, Beckett, is not in the keeping of the clubs of London. It never was. It is my own, and I will spend it exactly as I choose, and I choose to spend it fetching back the one person who ever looked at this chair and saw a man. Send to the stables. No, you cannot send me 40 miles in a barrow chair after a mail coach. Be sensible. Send for my solicitor and for my aunt, who will not have reached London yet and can be caught at Marchford, and for the register of the parsonage she came from, and for everything we have on where a physician's daughter named Sharp would go to ground. I am going to find her, Beckett. And when I have found her, I am going to do the thing my cousin most fears and my aunt most wishes and I have most wanted and least dared. And I am going to do it in the teeth of the whole world, and the world may say what it likes. For I have discovered this morning that there is exactly one opinion in the world I value, and she has gone, and I mean to get her back. He found her in 11 days, which was fast, because Lucian Vane brought to the finding of Eliza Sharp the same relentless method he brought to a disputed boundary, and because a physician's daughter with a good hand and a rare education does not vanish entirely, but leaves a track for a patient man to follow. She had gone to the cathedral town of Fernbridge, 30 miles off, and taken, on the strength of the character Mrs. Prout had honestly given her, a situation as reader and companion to an elderly blind gentlewoman, a Mrs. Calloway, who wanted someone to read her the newspapers and her late husband's library, and did not care whether the someone had been a housemaid. It was, Lucian thought, exactly the situation Eliza would find, honest and quiet and beneath her and safe, and it told him she had not gone to a bad end, and he was glad of it, and it did not for one moment alter his intention. He went to Fernbridge himself. It was a considerable undertaking, 40 miles by easy stages in a specially sprung carriage with Beckett to lift him, 3 days of the exhausting business that travel had become for him since the accident. And he did it without complaint, because there was a thing at the end of it worth any exhaustion, and because he had understood, somewhere on the road, that he had spent 3 years letting the difficulty of moving through the world shrink his world to 3 rooms, and that this was the last and worst effect of the accident, worse than the chair, the shrinking, the giving up of the sky and the road and the pursuit of anything that could not be reached without being carried. And that Eliza had begun to cure him of it on a drove road, and that he meant to finish the cure himself, by crossing 40 miles to fetch her, carried the whole way and not ashamed. He called on Mrs. Calloway and the old blind lady, charmed and mystified by a Duke in her small parlor, sent for her reader. And Eliza Sharp came into the room and saw who sat there, in the wheeled chair by the window, and went white, and then still, and Lucian watched her master herself with the visible effort he knew so well and said, before she could speak, "Mrs. Calloway, I am obliged to you for your hospitality, and I must beg a further kindness, which is a quarter of an hour alone with Miss Sharp, who was my clerk, and who left my house 11 days ago under a misapprehension that I have come 40 miles to correct, and who is, I promise you, in no kind of trouble, unless it is the trouble of being pursued by a determined man, which at my age and in my condition I had not expected to be doing, and find I do rather well." The old lady, who had been young once and had not forgotten it, laughed and had herself led out and left them alone, and Eliza stood by the door with her hands folded and her chin up, armored, and said, "You should not have come, your grace. You will only make it harder. I wrote you why I went. I meant every word of it." "You wrote me a great deal of true and steady sentences," Lucian said, "and then you let a single tear fall on the paper and did not blot it out, and that tear told me more than all the sentences, which is that you did not want to go, and went because you thought it was right. And I have come 40 miles to tell you that you reasoned, for the first time since I have known you, from a false premise, and reached a wrong conclusion, and I am going to prove it to you the way we proved the western boundary. On the ground with the evidence, because it is the only way you will believe anything." He wheeled his chair a little nearer, and she did not retreat, though he saw she wanted to. "My cousin came to you. He offered you money, and you refused it, and he threatened your father's name, and you did not care, and then he told you that to stay was to ruin me, to make me a byword, to spoil the one thing my accident left me, my dignity, and that a woman who truly loved me would go. And you believed it because you already half believed it, and you went, and you told yourself leaving was love. That is the whole of it. Tell me if I have any part of it wrong." "You have none of it wrong," Eliza said low. "And it is true, your grace. It is true. I am a housemaid. You are the Duke of Northwood. If you marry me, the whole world will call it a duke ruined by a scheming servant, and it will follow you into every room for the rest of your life, and I could not bear to be the thing that did that to you when you have borne so much already. Gervase is a snake and I despise him, but the snake told the truth, and I went because of the truth and not because of the snake, and you cannot argue me out of the truth. Your Grace, not in a quarter hour, not in a year. I do not mean to argue you out of the truth, Lucian said. I mean to show you that you have mistaken what the truth is. You believe my dignity is a thing made of the world's opinion, a thing the clubs of London keep for me and can take away. Eliza, look at me. Look at the chair. 3 years ago the world's opinion decided that the Duke of Northwood was an object of pity, a broken thing, a tragedy, and it has held that opinion every day since in every drawing room in England, and there is nothing I can do to change it, and do you know what I have discovered? It does not signify. Not at all. The world's pity has not touched my dignity by so much as a hair, because my dignity was never in the world's keeping. It is my own. It is the thing that made me settle the western boundary from a chair, and finish the survey the steward said could not be finished, and refuse for 3 years to let a single soul see me flinch. A man whose dignity the world could spoil would have been spoiled by the pity long ago. Mine survived the pity. Do you imagine it cannot survive a marriage? The world will say what it likes of us, exactly as it has said what it likes of me for 3 years, and it will be exactly as powerless to touch us as it has been to touch me, because we will neither of us have handed it the keeping of our worth. That is the false premise, Eliza. You think a duke's dignity is fragile, a thing of reputation, breakable by scandal. It is the least fragile thing about me. It is the one thing the wall did not break, and Gervase cannot break it, and marrying you would not break it. Marrying you would be the finest and freest use I have ever made of it, and the world's noise about it would be no more to me than the world's pity has been, which is to say nothing, nothing at all, a sound outside a window I stopped hearing years ago. Eliza had not moved from the door, but something in her face had begun to give way, the armor cracking along a seam, and Lucian pressed on, gently, relentlessly, the way he pressed a boundary. You said on the drove road that you were glad of the man in the chair, and would not trade him for the man on the horse. Did you mean it? You know I meant it. I never say what I do not mean. Then hear the same thing back, for it is the whole of my case. I would not trade the woman who poured cold water on me for every suitable lady in England. I did not fall in love with a housemaid, Eliza. I fell in love with the only person in 3 years who looked at this chair and saw a man, and told me my glove would blister my hand, and settled the western boundary, and let me tell the truth about the wall, and wept one tear onto a note and would not blot it out. That person happens to be in service through no fault of her own, and the world will make what it can of that, and I do not care. And I have come 40 miles carried by my valet to tell you that I do not care, which is itself, if you think about it, the strongest evidence I could offer, for a man who cared what the world thought would not have made this journey, and a man who has made this journey has proved past all argument that he has stopped hearing the sound outside the window. Come home, Eliza. Not as my clerk. I am asking you to come home and marry me in the teeth of the whole world, and let the world say what it likes, and be, the two of us, the one thing neither the wall nor Gervase nor all the clubs of London can spoil, which is a man and a woman who saw each other plainly and were not afraid. I have never asked anyone for anything since the accident. I am asking you. Do not make me have come 40 miles for nothing, for I am very tired, and it would be a most undignified end to a grand gesture, and you would never let me forget it. And Eliza Sharp, at the door with the armor cracked through at last, gave a sound that was half a laugh and half a sob, and crossed the small parlor, and knelt down by the wheeled chair so that her face was level with his, which no one did, which everyone avoided, the coming down to his level, and she took his scarred hand in both of hers the way she had taken it the first day over the spilled tea, and she said, "You impossible, impossible man. You have argued me out of the truth after all in a quarter of an hour, which I said you could not do, and I do not even mind being wrong, which has never once happened to me before, and I begin to think it is a thing that will go on happening now, my being argued out of my certainties by a duke in a chair, for the rest of my life. Yes, yes, I will come home. Yes, I will marry you, God help us both, and let the world say what it likes. And I will pour cold water on you when you scald yourself and tell you when your temper is showing and love you until I die. And if that oily creature Gervase comes near either of us again, I will do a thing to him that is not at all ladylike. For I have wanted to these 3 weeks and only refrained out of respect for your name, which I now find you do not care about. So there is nothing to stop me. And Lucian Vane laughed, really laughed, and took her face in his 2 hands there in the little parlor of a blind gentlewoman's house, and neither of them said anything for a while, and the world outside the window went on making its noise, and neither of them heard it at all. Gervase Vane's undoing came, as these things do, from the collision of his own desperation with the very transformation he had tried to prevent, and Lucian was nearly too slow to see it, because a man newly happy is a man with his guard down, and Lucian had been happier, those December weeks after Eliza came home, than at any time since the wall. They were to be married in the new year, quietly, at the estate church, and the reading of the banns had gone out, and the county had reacted precisely as everyone had predicted, with astonishment and gossip and a good deal of unkindness, and Lucian had discovered that he had told Eliza no more than the truth, that the noise of it reached him as a sound outside a window and touched nothing. What he had not reckoned was what the banns would do to Gervase. For the reading of the banns was the announcement, to the one man in England who most dreaded it, that the Duke of Northwood meant to marry, and would in all likelihood get an heir, and that the inheritance Gervase had counted on for 3 years, and against which, Lucian learned too late, he had been borrowing heavily from the sort of men who lend against expectations, was about to vanish. And Gervase, ruined, pressed by his creditors, his whole plausible life collapsing, ceased to be a schemer and became a desperate man, which is a far more dangerous thing. He came to Northwood in the black of a December night, and he did not come alone, and he did not come to persuade. Lucian pieced the whole of it together afterward and told it, when he told it at all, plainly and without drama, because the drama was not the point. The point was Eliza. Gervase had come with 2 men, hard men hired in the town with the last of his credit, and he had come with a document, a deed of settlement drawn up by a corrupt attorney, that would, if the Duke could be got to sign and seal it before witnesses, bind a great part of the unentailed Northwood estate to Gervase irrevocably, marriage or no marriage, heir or no heir. And Gervase had come, in his desperation, to obtain that signature by whatever means the night afforded, having persuaded himself, as desperate men do, that a crippled cousin alone in a great house with a skeleton staff could be frightened, or forced, or worse, into a signature, and that once the thing was sealed and witnessed the law would not easily undo it, and he would be saved. It was a mad plan, the plan of a man past reason, and it very nearly did a terrible harm, and it failed in the end on the one thing Gervase had never once in 3 years thought to reckon with, which was the will of the man in the chair. They came in by the garden door, which a bribed under-footman had left unbarred near 1 in the morning when the house slept, and they came up through the dark to the library, where a light still burned because Lucian, unable to sleep for happiness, had had Beckett settle him at his work, and Eliza, who could not sleep either, had come down in her wrapper to sit with him, and the 2 of them were there, alone, over the eastern parishes, when the door opened and Gervase came in with his 2 men behind him, and his ruined smile and the document in his hand. Lucian understood the whole of it in an instant, the men, the paper, the garden door, his cousin's face, understood that this was not a scheme now but a cornered animal, and understood with a cold clarity that steadied him even as it frightened him, that the immediate danger was not to himself, whom Gervase needed alive to sign, but to Eliza, who was a witness Gervase could not afford, and who stood now between the desk and the 2 hard men in her wrapper with her hair down, unarmed and alone and in the way. Beckett slept in the far wing. The bell would bring him, and the grooms, but not in time, not before these men in this room did whatever the night had brought them to do. And the library had two doors, the one they had come in by and the low door to the muniment passage that led to the servants' stair. And if Eliza could reach the muniment door and get through it and turn its heavy key from the far side, she would be into the passage and up the stair and rousing the house, safe, away, out of the reach of the men. But the muniment door was 15 feet from where she stood, and one of the hired men stood nearer to it than she did, and would reach it first. And Lucian saw all of this in the single second after the library door opened, saw the whole geometry of the danger, and saw that there was no one to secure that door and no time to do it. No one who could cross the room and put himself between Eliza and the men and turn the key. No one who could cross the room. Lucian Vane had not stood on his own legs in 3 years. His physicians had told him, in the careful language of men delivering a sentence, that the injury to his spine was such that the use of his legs was gone and would not return, and they had been right, and he had believed them, and had built 3 years of life on the believing. And yet the physicians, in their carefulness, had told him also, in an aside he had never had reason to think of again, that the paralysis was not total, that some deep thread of sensation and even of movement remained, useless for walking, insufficient to bear him, a flicker in dead limbs, and had warned him that a man in his condition must never attempt to force those limbs, for the effort would be agony and the fall certain and the damage real. He had never attempted it. There had never been a reason worth the agony and the fall and the damage. He had sat in his chair for 3 years because sitting was sense, and standing was ruin. He stood now. He did not decide to. It was not a decision any more than crossing a ballroom is a decision to a man who cannot stand still. It was the body moving ahead of the mind, the will seizing the dead limbs and commanding them by sheer force through a wall of pain that whited out the room, both hands crushing down on the edge of the great oak table, the arms he had spent 3 years making strong hauling the useless weight of him upright, the legs beneath him screaming and buckling and holding, for 1 second too, on nothing, but the fury of a man who would not, let 2 hired men reach the door before the woman he loved. He got his feet under him. The pain was beyond anything the wall had done to him. He heard himself make no sound, because the one thing 3 years had taught him past forgetting was to make no sound. And he took a step, one lurching, agonized step along the table's edge that no physician in England would have believed, and it put his body between Eliza and the muniment door, and he flung out one hand and turned the great key that stood in that lock, the near door, the one they had come in by, so that the way behind the hired men was shut, and he stood swaying on his dead, ruined legs with his hand on the turned key and his face like the face of a man in the last extremity, and he said, in a voice that came out of him with the whole force of the 9th Duke of Northwood behind it, low and absolute and terrible in the small room, the voice that had made men obey him since he was 22 and made them obey him now. Lock the doors. Eliza, the muniment door behind you, the key, turn it and go, now. And Eliza Sharp, who did not freeze, who had never frozen, who had poured cold water on a duke in her first hour, and settled a boundary in the wind, did not waste the gift he had bought with his body on a scream or a hesitation. She turned and reached the muniment door in 3 steps while the hired men stood 1 instant paralyzed by the impossible sight of the crippled duke risen and standing and commanding, and she turned its heavy key and dragged it open and was through it. And she did the one thing more that saved them all, which was that she did not flee up the stair to save herself, but turned in the passage and threw her whole weight on the great iron bar that closed the muniment door from the passage side. An ancient bar meant to protect the deeds from fire and theft, and shot it home, sealing the library and the men and Gervase inside it, cut off from the rest of the house, trapped, with only the risen swaying duke between them and nothing. And then she flew up the servants' stair crying the alarm at the top of her voice through the sleeping house, Beckett, Beckett, the grooms, to the library, come, come now. Lucian held the room the way he had held his own dignity for 3 years, by sheer will past the point where will should have failed. He could not have crossed to strike a man, he could barely stand. But he stood between the trapped men and the barred door, and he looked at his cousin Gervase across the small lamplit room with the whole cold authority of his house. And he said, "You came into my house at night with hired men to force my hand, Gervase, and you have failed, because you never once in 3 years understood the only thing about me that mattered, which is that I am not a broken thing but a man. And a man will do, for the woman he loves, a thing that breaks every rule of his body. And you cannot hire men enough to stand against it. The door behind you is barred. The house is roused. In 1 minute Beckett, who was a soldier, will be at that door with the grooms, and you will be taken, and it is over, and you have ruined yourself far past anything the loss of my acres would have done. For you have added to your debts the small matter of a felony, and I will not lift a finger to save you from it, though I will not, for the family's sake, make it worse than it must be. Sit down, cousin. Put down the paper, it is finished." And he did not add, because he did not need to, that a man who had just risen from a wheeled chair by force of will to command a room was not, and never had been, and never would be, the pitiable ruin his cousin had staked everything on. That the standing had proved, past all argument, in front of the two hard men who now would not meet his eyes and the cousin who had gone gray, the thing Eliza had known from the first day and Gervase had never grasped, that the dignity of the Duke of Northwood was the least broken thing in the house, and had only been waiting, all this while, for a cause worth spending itself upon. Then Beckett's shoulder hit the barred door from the passage side, and the bar gave, and it was, as Lucian had promised, over. And violence, such little as there was, happened past the door and out of his sight, the two hired men taken by Beckett and the grooms in the passage with no great trouble, for hired men do not fight hard for a ruined master once the house is roused. And Gervase Vane sat down in the library and put his head in his hands and did not resist at all, being, at the last, not a villain of any size, but only a weak and frightened man who had gambled his whole life on another man's remaining broken, and lost. And Lucian Vane, the cause won and the room held and the danger past, let go at last of the edge of the table, and the dead legs that had borne him for one impossible minute gave way entirely, and he went down. And it was Eliza, back down the stair and across the room in an instant, who caught him, who got her shoulder under his arm and eased him down so that he did not fall hard, who held him on the library floor with his head against her and the pain of the ruined effort washing white through him, and who said over and over fiercely into his hair, not a word of pity, never a word of pity, but, "You impossible man, you impossible, impossible man, you stood up. I will never forgive you and I will never stop loving you, hold on to me. Beckett is coming, hold on to me. I have you, I have you." The hours after that night were the worst Eliza had known since her father died, and the best, both at once, and she did not leave his side through any of them. They had carried him up to his bed, Beckett and the grooms, gently, once the house was secured, and Gervase, and his men were shut under guard in the gun-room to wait for the morning and the constable. And Lucian had been past speaking by then, gray and shaking with the aftermath of the ruinous effort, the pain of the wrenched back come down on him like a falling wall, and Eliza had sent for the physician and then done, while they waited, the plain competent nursing her father had taught her, which was the one gift she had that the moment wanted. She got the cold sweat off him and the warmth back into him. She braced the injured back with pillows the way the physician eased it. She held the cup of water to his cracked lips, and above all she stayed in the chair by the bed through the long remainder of the night and the fevered day that followed, and did not once let him see fear in her face, because she had understood from the first that fear shown to Lucian Vane was only pity in a hurry, and he could bear anything but that. The fever came up in the small hours, as the physician had warned it might, the body's answer to the violence done it, and in the fever Lucian was not always himself, and talked, low and disjointed, of the wall and the black morning and the long red agony after, reliving in the fever the thing he never spoke of waking. And Eliza sat and held his hand and answered him steadily out of the dark, telling him he was not on the horse, that the wall was 3 years past, that he was in his own bed and safe and she was there, until the fevered fear eased and he quieted. And once, near dawn of that first bad day, He had come half to himself and looked at her with clearing eyes and said, in a cracked whisper, "You are still here. I thought I dreamed you. I thought I had dreamed the whole of you, the tea and the boundary and the parlor at Fernbridge, and woken back into the year before you came, the dark year, alone." And Eliza had leaned close and said, fierce and low, "You did not dream me. I am here and I am not going anywhere, not to Fernbridge, not anywhere, not ever again. I went once and it was the great mistake of my life, and I have come home and I am staying. And you are stuck with me, your grace, sick or well, chair or no chair, to the end of both our days. So you may as well stop dreaming the dark year, for it is over, and I am the proof of it, sitting in this chair, not going anywhere. Sleep now. I will be here when you wake. I will be here every time you wake for the rest of your life. That is a promise, and I do not make promises I will not keep. You know that of me if you know anything." And Lucian had closed his eyes and slept, this time without the fever's fear, one hand loose in both of hers. And Eliza had sat through the dawn watching him breathe, and had not been able to stop the tears at last, silent. The tears she had not let him see, falling not from fear now, for the fever was breaking, but from the sheer flood of a love too large to hold, for a proud, broken, brave, impossible man who had risen from a wheeled chair on ruined legs to put his body between her and harm, and had lain in a fever reliving the worst morning of his life, and had woken afraid only that he had dreamed her. The physician came, and scolded, and dressed the wrenched back, and gave it as his grave opinion that the Duke had likely done himself a further and lasting injury, and must be kept still for weeks, and must never, never repeat such folly. And Eliza had shown him out and then come back and sat down and taken up Lucian's hand again, and thought that she did not care, in that hour, whether the standing had cost him a further injury, that she would not have had him not do it, that a man was more than a spine, and that Lucian had proved in that one impossible minute what he was made of past any proving, and that she would spend the rest of her life, exactly as she had promised the doctor, making sure there was never again a cause worth such a cost. But that she would not, could not, be sorry he had been the kind of man who would pay it. Lady Aurelia came, summoned by express, and swept into the sick-room braced for tragedy, and found instead her nephew mending, and a housemaid asleep upright in the bedside chair with his hand in hers, having not left it in 2 days. And the old woman had stood in the doorway and looked at the two of them a long moment, and then had gone out again quietly and told Beckett to see that Miss Sharp had a proper meal brought to her and a shawl, for the girl would take a chill sitting up in her wrapper, and to see that no one, on pain of Lady Aurelia's grave displeasure, disturbed her. And had said to Beckett, in the passage, in a voice not quite steady, "I told him, Beckett, that the foolish ones who marry where their hearts are have the right of it, and the sensible ones waste their lives. I have never in my 74 years been so glad to be proved right by a nephew who never takes my advice. See, that girl is looked after. She is going to be the Duchess of Northwood, and she has earned it 3 times over in this room alone. And if I hear one word below stairs against the match, I will know the source of it and deal with it myself." And Beckett, who had held the same opinion since the day of the spilled tea, had said, "Yes, my lady," with a satisfaction he did not trouble to hide, and had gone to fetch the shawl. Lucian mended, slowly, over the following weeks, the fever gone and the wrenched back easing by hard degrees back toward its old bad baseline, and no worse in the end than that. The physician's fear of a lasting further injury proved, by the mercy of a strong constitution, to be exaggerated, though Lucian never afterward let anyone tell him he had got off lightly, for the weeks of pain had been real, and he would not have the price of the standing minimized any more than he would have it magnified into a miracle. And through all the weeks of mending, Eliza was there, having moved, with Lady Aurelia's brisk blessing and the whole household's now unanimous approval, entirely out of the servants' world and into the place that was already hers in fact before it was hers in law, the place at his side. And Lucian, mending under her steady, unpitying care, understood that the crisis had done, in a single terrible night, the thing all the weeks of tenderness had not quite managed, which was to burn away the last of the 3 walls, to make the impossible plainly possible, because a man and a woman who have been through such a night together, who have held each other on a library floor and sat out a fever hand in hand, are past the point where the world's opinion of housemaids and dukes has any power to stand between them, and he set the wedding, the moment he could sit up and hold a pen, for the soonest day the bands allowed, and this time no caution closed his hand, and no clock broke the moment, and he finished at last from his sickbed, with Eliza's hand in his, the sentence he had begun so many times at midnight and never once managed to end. He paid for the standing and paid dearly, and Eliza would not let anyone pretend otherwise, least of all Lucian himself. He was 3 weeks in his bed after that night, in a pain that the physician, summoned in haste, called the entirely predictable consequence of a thing no man in his condition should ever attempt, and scolded him for, at length, until Eliza put the physician out of the room. The effort had wrenched and torn what the wall had left. There was fever for a time, and the deep grinding ache did not leave his back for a month, and the physician warned, gravely, that he might have done himself a lasting further injury, and that he must never on his life attempt such a thing again. And Lucian, flat on his back and gray with pain, had said only, "I would do it again tomorrow, for the same cause, and count the price cheap, and if you tell me once more that I should not have, I will have Beckett carry you to your gig." And Eliza, sitting by the bed where she sat now day and night, had said, "He is not to be scolded for it, doctor, he is to be thanked, and then never permitted to do it again, and I will see to the second part myself, for I intend to be beside him the rest of his life expressly to make sure there is never again a cause worth it, which is the only cure for a man like this, not medicine but the removal of all occasions for heroism, and I mean to remove them." For there was no cure, and neither of them ever pretended there was, and this Lucian insisted upon with a fierceness that surprised those who did not understand him, because he had spent 3 years refusing to be pitied and would not now, at the end, accept the false comfort that would have been the deepest pity of all, the story that love had mended his body. Love had not mended his body. He rose from that bed after 3 weeks as he had lain down in it, a man whose legs would not bear him, who lived and would always live in a wheeled chair. The standing had been a single act of will bought at ruinous cost, not a door opening, and he said so plainly to anyone who tried to make a miracle of it. What the effort had proved was not that he could walk, for he could not, and never would. What it had proved was only what Eliza had known from the first hour, and Gervase had died inside for never grasping, that the man in the chair was whole in every way that a man is truly whole, and had never been broken where it counted, and could do, at need, a thing that broke the rules of his body, not because the body was healing, but because the will and the love that drove it were larger than the body's rules. There was, in the slow months after, one small mercy that Lucian allowed himself to be glad of without letting it become a lie. Working with the physician, and with a patience Eliza compelled out of him, he found that the deep flicker of movement the doctors had always said remained in his ruined legs could, with long careful exercise, be coaxed into a little more. Not into walking, never into walking, but into the strength to stand, braced for a moment, between 2 canes or on Eliza's arm, to rise from the chair to a bed or a carriage seat with less lifting, to meet a man he respected on his feet for the space of a handclasp. It was a small thing, hard won over a year and more of daily labor, and it did not change the great fact of the chair. But it was real, and it was his, earned by work and not given by a miracle, and Lucian valued it exactly for what it was, a little hard-earned liberty and no more, and refused to let anyone ever call it a recovery, because to call it a recovery was to say that the man before it had been less, and Eliza had taught him past all forgetting that the man before it had been enough. Gervase Vane was not hanged, nor transported, nor exposed, though he had earned all 3, because Lucian, who could have destroyed him utterly, chose instead a colder and more merciful justice. He would not have the family name in the assize courts. And so he settled his cousin's most pressing debts, which surprised everyone, and then stripped him of every expectation forever by the simple public act of a new settlement that left Gervase not 1 acre and not 1 shilling of Northwood. and gave him, in exchange for signing away all claim and quitting England, a small fixed annuity, barely enough to live on, paid quarterly through an agent in a foreign town for the rest of his life, on the condition that he never return. It was, everyone agreed, a great deal more than Gervase deserved, and a great deal less than he had gambled for, and it was, Lucian said, the just reckoning. The man had wanted everything and would now have exactly enough, and would live out his days in a shabby continental exile knowing precisely what his own weakness had cost him, which was a punishment more complete and more lasting than any the courts could have given, and one that spilled no blood and made no martyr and dragged no name through the mud. Gervase took it, of course. Weak men always take the annuity, and went abroad and was not heard of again, and the inheritance he had ruined himself to keep passed, in the fullness of time, exactly where he had most feared it would. For there was, in the end, an heir. Lucian and Eliza were married in the estate church in the new year, quietly, as they had planned, with Lady Orlaia in the front pew weeping, and refusing to admit it, and Becket standing up as the Duke's man and Mrs. Calloway, the blind gentlewoman, brought 40 miles as the nearest thing the bride had to family, listening to the whole of it with a radiant face, and telling everyone afterward that she had known from the first day the Duke came to her parlor how it would end. The county came in the end, because a duke's wedding is a duke's wedding, and stayed to gossip, and went home over the following months and years, gradually and then entirely conquered, exactly as the household had been conquered, by the plain undeniable fact of a Duchess of Northwood who knew every tenant's name and settled boundaries in the wind, and ran the great survey to its triumphant completion and bore herself, in the teeth of every whisper about the housemaid who married a duke, with a dignity so complete that the whispers, having nothing to feed on, starved and died, and within a few years no one in the county could quite remember having ever thought the match a scandal, and told each other instead that the Duke of Northwood had always been the cleverest man in 3 counties, and had naturally chosen the cleverest woman, which was true, and easier to say than the truth about their own earlier unkindness, which is a thing counties are always glad to forget. The great survey was finished the 2nd year of the marriage. 40,000 acres and 11 villages in 400 years, the mountain the stewards had said could not be climbed, and it was bound in 4 vast volumes and is at Northwood still, and the last page of it carries, in the Duke's own hand, a line that the visitors who are shown it never quite know what to make of. That this work was completed by the 9th Duke and his Duchess, who came to it first as his clerk, and without whom neither the survey nor the man who made it would have been brought to any good end. Eliza had told him it was too much, and he had refused to change a word, and it stands. They had many years, more than the physicians would have promised, and they were good years, full and warm and quarrelsome and busy, for neither of them had it in them to be idle or to be silent, and they argued to the end of their days about boundaries and books and the price of things, and whether a fault was ever partly the Atlas's, and loved each other the more for every argument. The children came and grew, and climbed on their father's chair to be told stories of the drove road and the survey, and knew him always exactly as Eliza had known him first, not as a tragedy in a chair, but as the deepest and most commanding and most beloved man in their world, a father whose lap was a place of perfect safety though his legs would not bear him, whose voice could still their squabbles from across a room, whose chair was not a sorrow to them because it had never once been treated as a sorrow in that house. For Eliza had set the tone of the whole household in her first hour, pouring cold water on a scald without a tremble of pity, and the household and the marriage and the children had all been built on that same foundation ever after, the plain, unsentimental refusal to see the man as anything less than whole. Lucian Vane thought about it sometimes, in his later years, sitting in his chair at the long library window that looked over the acres he had mapped, with his wife somewhere in the house making it warm and his children's voices coming faint from the garden. He thought that a horse and a stone wall had ended his life on a black morning, and that he had spent 3 years believing that was the whole of the story, a man broken and set aside to endure, and that then a housemaid had come in with a tray and spilled the tea and poured cold water on him without asking, and had refused from that first hour to see him broken, and had gone on refusing it every day of their life together, until the refusing became true, until he had become, under the steady warmth of a person who would not pity him, the whole man she had insisted from the beginning that he was. He had risen from his chair once by the force of will and love, and it had proved a thing worth proving and cured nothing and cost him dearly, and he had never regretted it. But that single standing was not, he knew, the true triumph of his life, and he never let anyone believe it was. The true triumph was quieter and had taken years and could not be seen. It was that a proud and isolated man, sentenced to a chair and to solitude, had been reached at the last by a brave and stubborn and clever woman who saw him plainly and was not afraid, and had let himself be reached, and had learned in the teeth of everything the wall had taken to be loved. And that this and not the walking he would never do was the whole of what a man was for, and the whole of what he had, at the end of a life he had once thought ended, been given past all deserving. And he was grateful for it every day to the end, more grateful than he ever managed to say, though Eliza, who had always known everything, knew that too, and never once required him to say it, which was, of all the mercies she had shown him, perhaps the greatest.